An emerging global health issue is antibiotic and antimicrobial drug resistance. So for my policy statement, I'm proposing a week-long set of lesson plans around the topic of drug resistance for a biology classroom that addresses why drug resistance happens, why it matters, and what can be done. The policy is that the teacher will create a set of drug resistance week lessons in a biology classroom to educate around topics related to drug resistance. Students will develop an understanding of antibiotic and antimicrobial resistant bacteria in the three ways I already mentioned: how they happen biologically, why do they matter, that is this a significant or an insignificant issue, and finally, how can biology students affect change on this issue? That could be in their personal lives or as agents of change with respect to government or the scientific community. The first question to address is, how are antibiotic or antimicrobial resistant bacteria created? That is, how do they happen biologically? To address this question, the students will engage in a simulation activity, watch a video, complete assigned readings, and participate in lecture and discussion to learn how drug-resistant bacteria are created. This ties into the biology curriculum with the next generation science standards. In particular ways, the students are expected to develop an understanding of the potential for a species to increase in number, in this case the drug-resistant bacteria, the heritable genetic variation of individuals in a species due to mutation. That's one of the subtopics of how these are created, and the proliferation of those organisms that are better able to survive and reproduce in the environment, which is a natural selection situation, for which drug-resistant bacteria are a great example. Also, the notion that advantageous heritable traits tend to increase in proportion to organisms lacking this trait. A different standard, but yet a core concept of natural selection. Drug-resistant bacteria is a great topic for addressing that. So on the first day, the students will participate in a simulation activity to show how drug-resistant traits are favored by natural selection. The teacher would presumably divide the kids up into different groups, A, B, and C, and then have them all wiped out by an antibiotic and sit down. And then in a second round of simulation, the teacher would put a hat on one of the students and call him or her group R for resistant. After antibiotics are administered, R stays standing and begins to divide. That is, puts more hats on other body parts, like a hand or a knee. And then in round 3, before antibiotics are administered, person R will pass hats to other bacteria to suggest transferring resistant genes to other bacteria. So that's the simulation I would suggest. Also, the teacher would have the students brainstorm what we know about drug resistance and discuss their questions. The teacher could suggest questions such as, what are the benefits of antibiotics and antimicrobials? What is the role of good hygiene and disease prevention? And how are antibiotics used in agriculture, which is an interesting subtopic of this. And then finally, on the first day, the students would watch an online animation on drug resistance in bacteria as sort of a third perspective for the first day's lesson. The topic of how drug-resistant bacteria are created is continued in day 2. Some more curriculum connections. Students will construct an explanation based on evidence for how natural selection leads to adaptation of populations. Kind of more of the same from day 1, but in particular, students will, for their homework leading into day 2, will read an article about drug resistance as an adaptation and answer some questions. They will come prepared to discuss the article at the beginning of class. Another curriculum connection is that students need to be able to evaluate the evidence supporting claims that changes in environmental conditions can result in increases in the number of certain species, the emergence of new species over time, and the extinction of species. In this case, the changing environment is the individual's microbiome. The change would be the introduction of antibiotics or antimicrobials. And one thing that the students need to discuss is whether or not a drug-resistant bacteria is a new species. Another curriculum connection is that students need to be able to ask questions to clarify about the role of DNA and chromosomes in coding instructions for traits passed from parents to offspring. So this is bacteria passing traits to their offspring, or sometimes to peer bacteria. And so the teacher will have the students watch a video and to deliver a lecture in tandem with it by pausing the video and expanding on certain points and allowing them to take notes on cellular mechanisms for drug resistance, how the cells resist the drugs, and genetic mechanisms for the development and sharing of drug-resistant traits between and among bacteria. On day 3, the teacher will move on to the second question, which is, why do drug-resistant bacteria matter? In other words, is the concern significant? So to start out day 3, the teacher will introduce some CDC materials indicating the urgency of the issue about drug resistance, antibiotic resistance, and in particular the 2013 threat report, which suggests that this is an emerging and urgent global issue. Also on day 3, students will watch sections of a Frontline documentary about drug-resistant bacteria, which was released in the fall of 2013, so it's completely current and does a great job of conveying the crisis nature of this issue and how serious it is. The quotation here, the CDC estimates that in the U.S. more than 2 million people are sickened every year with antibiotic-resistant infections, with at least 23,000 dying as a result. These are conservative estimates based on the best approximations from currently available data. And so this quotation from the threat report is an indication that certainly in the United States, this is a crisis and it is significant. And throughout the data and information conveyed on this day, we'll also share that this is a global phenomenon as well. The final question, what can be done? And in our case, what can high school biology students do about the issue, will be addressed in the rest of Drug Resistance Week. I suggest 3 days for it, days 4, 5, and 6, for students to engage in a 2-day research project followed by 1 day of presentations. That could be adjusted based on the size of the class. The teacher could also introduce the research project earlier in the unit to allow the kids to get started on their research. However, I didn't suggest that because a lot of times the students would need to get started, do a bunch of research on background information that's going to be addressed in the class anyway, in order for them to be able to address these questions meaningfully. So I suggest that the teacher waits until day 4 to introduce the research once the students have already been exposed to the background knowledge. That said, some suggested topics for the students to pursue would be hand washing implications in the home or in the clinical setting, appropriate versus inappropriate antibiotic or hand sanitizer use, which particular superbugs are the greatest threats and why. We already had the students discuss antibiotics and livestock, but that could be an interesting presentation topic. What are the benefits and what are the risks? What is going on in the genes of bacteria to cause or transmit drug resistance? That was the subject of the video and lecture from day 2, but some students may want to look into that in a little bit more depth. Also, the future of antibiotics. What, if any, new antibiotics are in the pipeline, and what is the future of currently used antibiotics? What should scientists do to control the spread of superbugs? And the threat report suggests recommendations for scientists and or governments to do these 5 things: prevent infections from occurring, prevent resistant bacteria from spreading, tracking resistant bacteria, improving the use of antibiotics. That's from a science or governmental perspective. We already may have some students working on the notion from an individual perspective. And finally, promoting the development of new antibiotics and new diagnostic tests for resistant bacteria, so students could investigate any of those particular subtopics as they were interested. Also, finally, for an ambitious student, they might want to ask, what is the hygiene hypothesis, and how does it relate to the topic of drug resistance? It's worth noting that not all of these topics relate to action items. However, as the students engage a variety of subtopics and share presentations with each other, they'll be increasing the breadth of their understanding. Also, these are designed to be short presentations. When I suggest 1 day of presentations, I mean short 3 to 5 minute presentations. This is not an extensive research project. It's just designed to allow student inquiry into this topic of drug resistance and to let them learn through their investigation. This policy is not only for the students to develop a working knowledge of the issue of drug-resistant bacteria, but also for them to develop a toolkit of things that they can do in their personal lives or as they engage the scientific or government communities. And so as we go through the presentations, each class will maintain a running list of recommendations that the students give. At the end of the unit, these recommendations will be compiled and distributed to all the students in the classes as like a 1-page document for their reference, for personal use, for studying for a test, for sharing with their families, etc. This 1-page document will be categorized into, first of all, steps that I can take as an individual, additionally, steps the scientific community should take, and finally, steps that government should take to address the issue of drug-resistant bacteria. The rationale of this policy, in other words, why are we doing it, is, first of all, because the answer to the second question, do drug-resistant bacteria matter, is a definitive yes. This is an emerging global health crisis and is worthy of our attention. In order to be able to combat this issue, the population needs to be informed about it. And one of the places that can take place is in the biology classroom. Also, this is a current event in biology that relates to every student's experience. Thus, it's highly relevant for the students. Everybody has either taken an antibiotic, or if they haven't, it's probably because their family has a strong position on not using antibiotics. In either case, it's a relevant issue in the students' lives, which makes it a good place to be spending our time in the class. And then finally, drug resistance is related to the biology curriculum, especially for developing a deeper understanding of natural selection and genetics. Now that we've considered the reasons for the policy, let's look at the policy's specific goals. First of all, the students will develop a working knowledge of drug-resistant bacteria and improve their understanding of natural selection and genetics. That's the curriculum connection. Also, students will develop familiarity with CDC resources and other places to discover information on current biology topics, so that they're more equipped to investigate questions in the future. Third, students will develop a concrete list of action items related to the topic of drug resistance. And then finally, and related to all three above, is that a more informed population is better equipped to handle the challenges of this issue. Two quotations from the 2013 Drug Resistance Threat Report suggest that one of the key areas for action is improving the use of antibiotics. That will absolutely be on the list of action items for the students with specific recommendations. And the threat report also points out that only through concerted commitment and action will the nation ever be able to succeed in reducing this threat. And that's the underlying goal of this policy, is to develop a more informed population that can better handle the challenges of this issue. Hopefully, through implementing a drug resistance week structured along the recommendations of this policy, we will achieve just that with our group of biology students.